Okay, folks, today is going to be the very first video of the Tamerlan Chess Club YouTube channel. Probably the first in maybe a three-part series on how to play the game of Tamerlan Chess. We're out here on this beautiful cloudy day talking about Tamerlan Chess. And I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about who Tamerlan was and what Tamerlan Chess is and how it came to be. So Tamerlane was a Turco-Mongol conqueror in Persia in the 14th century. He followed in the footsteps of Genghis Khan. He went around all of Persia, which occupies today's countries of Iran, Iraq, Uzbekistan, the northern part of India, Turkey, all those countries around in that area. Tamerlane was a conqueror who traveled around and basically took over all those lands in Genghis Khan fashion. But he also had another side to him. While he was killing millions of people, at night he would go home and he was a fan of the arts. He was a fan of architecture. He was a fan of science, or what passed for science back then. And one of his biggest pastimes was the game of chess. And he didn't play the regular small 8x8 squared board of chess that we know today. He considered that too simple, because how could such a great mind as the conqueror Tamerlane just play the small game of chess? So of course he played a much larger game of chess, which was 11 by 10 squares. And basically, if we go to the history of chess and how this chess game came about, chess was invented somewhere around the year 500, probably, that we know of, in India, quickly traveled to Persia, the area that I spoke of earlier. The first form of it was called chaturanga, traveled to Persia and became shatranj, was the name of the game then. Rules very similar to chess that we have now. But when the Arabic conquest took over Persia, the Persians really didn't think too highly of the people of India. They considered them to be of low intellect, imbeciles, inferior people, basically. So they couldn't accept the fact that the game of chess originated in India, because in their minds, how could the Indians have possibly produce such an intellectual game when they themselves were not intellectual? So basically, in this vein, the Arab people, after they took over Persia, tried to rewrite history and started saying that they started inventing larger games of chess on 10 by 10 boards, 13 by 13 boards, very large games, and they started saying that these were the original forms of chess created by the Persians and the Arabic people, and that the people of India later reduced the game to the smaller 8 by 8 board because it was simpler. And which was erroneous history, obviously, but that was their story. So around this time when they were inventing all these larger games of chess, somewhere in the 13th to 14th century probably, Tamerlan Chess was born. And Tamerlan Chess, as you can see here, is an 11 by 10 squared board. It is 11 files and 10 ranks. So you've got 11 files along the XY axis and 10 ranks. That's 110 squares, and in addition there is 2 extra squares, one here that protrudes from the left side of rank 9 and one over here that protrudes from the right side of rank 2. Those extra squares are called citadels. They have a special purpose, which I will allude to later. So with the citadels, that makes a total of 112 squares in Tamerlan Chess. Originally, the board was uncheckered. I've made the board checkered here. This is my board from a piece of wood I bought at Home Depot and just stained the checkers in. But the original board in the 14th century, they played chess on uncheckered boards, which made it a little more difficult. All right, so, and unlike today, where we usually have white be the starting person, back then they decided who started chess by rolling a die. That's how they started the game. If we look at the pieces of Tamerlan Chess, you can see there's quite a few. There's 28 pieces on each side instead of the normal 16 pieces in a chessboard. Like I said, there's 11 files, which means 11 files of pieces all along, which also means 11 pawns. Interestingly, to make the game a little more complicated, each pawn is unique. Each pawn represents a piece in Tamerlan Chess, and when it reaches the far side of the board, it promotes to the piece that it represents, with 2 exceptions, which I will talk about later. Let's get started on what the pieces look like, and after that, that'll probably be the end of the first video because this is getting longer than I expected. This piece here is the rook. This is originally more what a rook looked like in early times in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 14th century. This is what a commoner's rook would look like. And basically, it moved the same way a rook does now. So it moves orthogonally as far as it wants, straight in any direction, moves the same as a rook, and basically it was thought to depict each of these peaks as a horse's head, so it's supposed to depict two horses pulling a chariot. Originally the rook designated a chariot. Over time, after it was taken over by the Arabic world and moved into Europe, it became known as more a mobile castle, like a siege tower, and that is the depiction of the rook that we know today. But originally two horses carrying a chariot. Next is the knight, which was called a faras or an asp back in the Arabic times in the 14th century, is meant to depict a rough horse's head, kind of an abstraction of a horse's head. And the rook back then moved the same as it does today in the L shape, one up, two over, two up, moved the same as a knight does today. Okay, the next piece over is the precursor of what our bishop is, or one of the precursors of a bishop. It was called a talia, which roughly translates into a scout in our language. And it moves the same as a modern bishop, except for one difference is that it must move at least 2 squares. So whereas our bishop moves along a diagonal, this talia also moves along a diagonal, but it must move at least 2 squares. So it must move at least from here to here and so on in any direction, and it does not jump. If there's a piece in the middle, it cannot move if it's a piece next to it. So it moves at least 2 squares, otherwise like a bishop. Next piece is known as the giraffe. Now the giraffe has a very elongated knight's move. If we place it here, it moves 1 square diagonally, followed by at least 3 squares straight. So 1 square diagonally, followed by at least 3 straight, and then more. It is also not a jumper. So it's important to know that it moves the diagonal space first, followed by at least 3 squares straight, and then in continuation, it is not a jumper. It becomes a powerful piece towards the end of the game when the board congestion is a little bit less. Because it's a non-leaper, it has trouble moving early in the game when there's still a lot of pieces on the board in the way. The next piece was known as a furs, which was translated by John Golan as a general. He was probably wrong about that. A closer translation is actually translated into minister. There is no queen in Tamerlan chess. The queen was an invention of, in Europe, probably the Italians. Also in the 14th century in Persia, there was no queen. Instead, sitting next to the king here, one of the pieces next to the king was this furs or minister. The minister moves 1 square diagonally. That's it. Any direction, 1 square diagonally. That's the minister. Now we have the king. The king, known as a shah back then, S-H-A-H. And interestingly, back then when someone's king was captured or trapped and couldn't move, we say checkmate. Originally that probably came from saying Shah Mat, which translated into the king is helpless. Shah Mat, S-H-A-H. S-H-A-H for king and M-A-T for mat, helpless. That's probably where checkmate comes from. The king moves just like our king, 1 space in any direction, except for a couple differences. One of them is just one time during the game, the king, when he's placed in either checkmate, or stalemate, he can trade places with any of his pieces to escape checkmate, or stalemate. That is the difference of the king. Alright, the next piece is called the Vizier. I'm going to go a little quicker now because we're already 10 minutes in and we're still talking about the pieces. So this is a Vizier, which translates probably into advisor. Also next to the king, remember there was no queen. The Vizier moves 1 square straight in any direction, 1 square orthogonally. We have another giraffe, which we've already talked about. We have a talia, a knight, and a rook, all which we've talked about. That takes care of our main row. Now the pawns, remember each pawn I said represents a piece. So we have the pawn of pawns. Before I talk about the pawns, let's talk about the back row. It'll make more sense. Back in the corner here we have the pil, P-I-L, which translates into elephant. This is also a precursor of our modern bishop. He's a weak piece and he moves exactly 2 squares diagonally in any direction. He's a leaper, so he can leap over pieces, and he moves 2 squares diagonally in any direction. That means he only has a total of 15 squares that he can land on the whole board out of 110 squares, because he's a weak piece. Next to him in the back row here, remember there's a piece only every other square in the back row. As you can see, the next one over is a camel. Jamal, they call him, Jamal, or Shatur, Shutur, translates into camel now. The camel has also an elongated knight's move, not quite as long as the giraffe. The camel moves 1 square diagonally and 2 squares straight. 1 square diagonally, 2 straight in any direction. So it's like a knight move, but stretched by 1 square. Also a jumper, a leaper. Here we have the war engine, or dababa, as it was referred to. This would be like your catapult or any type of machine they would have used during a war engine. He jumps 2 squares straight. He's a leaper and 2 squares straight, any direction, orthogonally. Also a pretty weak piece. He can only land on a total of about 30 squares on the board. Okay, now that I've shown all the pieces, there's another dababa, another jamal, another pill, elephant. Let's talk about quickly the 11 pawns, and that'll be the end of this video, and then we'll start getting into the actual game. The pawns, going from left to right for each player that represent each piece, are the pawn of pawns, pawn of dababas, pawn of jamals or camels, pawn of pills, elephant, pawn of the minister or furs, pawn of the shah, king, pawn of the advisor, pawn of the giraffe, pawn of the talia, pawn of the ferris or knight, pawn of the rook, going from left to right. There's your board, and there are all your pieces, and I'll see you in the next video.